Davi is a taxi driver who lives on the edge, always trying to find a way to pay the bills and keep his head up. His life is not easy. In addition to the exhaustion of spending hours in traffic, he also has to deal with a car full of problems, which seems to want to break down more than run. And as if that weren't enough, his boss, Jeremiah, is a hard person to please and is always putting more pressure on him than helping. One day, on a night of heavy rain, when the streets look like rivers and people just want to get home as quickly as possible, Davi comes across a scene that moves him. He sees a desperate mother trying to protect her young son from the rain, with no one around to help. Even though he is tired and knows that this could bring more complications to his already difficult routine, Davi decides to stop the car and offer help. Little did he know that this seemingly simple decision would be the starting point for a series of events that would change his life forever. What began as a gesture of kindness turned into a journey full of surprises, challenges, and discoveries that tested everything he believed in. David was a simple man who worked as a taxi driver to try to make a living. He was part of a fleet of taxis, but the car he drove was practically a walking miracle. It was always full of problems, made strange noises, and seemed like it could stop working at any moment. Even so, it was all he had, and David did everything he could to not let his passengers down. In addition, his boss, Jeremiah, was a real thorn in his side. Jeremiah didn't like David and seemed to enjoy making things difficult for him. He always found a reason to criticize or complain, as if David wasn't doing enough, even though he was trying his best. David also didn't have many choices. The money he earned was little, barely enough to pay the bills, and thinking about another job seemed like a distant dream. So he held on, driving day after day, trying to deal with the car problems, the demands of his boss, and the constant struggle to survive in a routine that seemed to have no end. Even with all these difficulties, there was something in David that kept him going. He knew he had to keep going, not only for himself, but perhaps for something bigger that he didn't yet understand. Little did David know that life was about to take a huge turn. It was one of those nights when the rain seemed to never end. The streets were dark, the sky full of thunder, and David, already exhausted, just wanted to end the day and go home. As he drove through the wet streets, he noticed something in the middle of a sidewalk. A small boy, soaked and visibly desperate, frantically waving for someone to stop. David, even though he was tired and a little suspicious, couldn't ignore it. He pulled over the taxi, rolled down the window, and asked, "What happened, kid? Are you okay?" The boy, who said his name was Pedro, was panting, and his eyes were full of concern. He explained that his mother, Manuela, was very weak and needed help. Without thinking twice, Davi decided to let Pedro get in the car and went to where his mother was. When he arrived, he found Manuela sitting on the sidewalk with a tired expression, as if carrying the weight of the rain was the least of her problems. Davi opened the door and insisted, "Ma'am, you need a doctor. Let me take you to the hospital." But Manuela shook her head and replied in a soft but firm voice, "No, please. Just take me to the cemetery. That's where I live with my son." That sentence made Davi uncomfortable. Who would ask to go to a place like that, especially on such a dark night? Even so, something inside him made him trust. He looked at Pedro, who was clasping his hands tightly, as if silently asking for help, and he didn't have the courage to refuse. With his heart racing and not knowing exactly where this would take him, Davi put the car in gear and headed to the destination Manuela had asked for. He had no idea what was coming, but he felt that this night would be different from all the others. When the taxi stopped in front of the cemetery, Davi felt butterflies in his stomach. The rain was still falling heavily, and the place seemed even more frightening under the dim glow of the streetlights. He looked at Pedro and then at Manuela, who was barely able to stand. Something inside him told him to leave, but another, stronger part told him he had to stay. Carefully, Davi helped Manuela out of the car. Pedro held her hand tightly as he guided them into the cemetery. They passed through the creaking gates and walked between graves and trees until they reached a small abandoned house. The house looked old and worn, but it was clean and tidy inside, showing that someone had turned the place into a home. "This is where we live," Pedro said with a shy smile as he helped his mother sit down in a worn but comfortable armchair. David, still trying to make sense of the situation, looked around. There wasn't much there, just some simple furniture, folded blankets, and an old kettle on a makeshift stove. Even so, the place looked welcoming, in a way he hadn't expected. "You live here in the cemetery?" he asked, unable to hide his surprise. Manuela nodded, her gaze calm despite her weakness. "It's not the place we dream of, but it's what we have. Life has been hard on us, but here we have found peace and a little corner to call our own." Feeling a mix of pity and admiration, Davi realized that the two needed more than words of comfort. He rolled up his sleeves and went to the small, makeshift kitchen. He rummaged through what they had and, with the few ingredients available, prepared a hot soup. While she was cooking, Manuela told her story. She had lost everything after a series of tragedies and, with nowhere to go, she found refuge in that place. Despite everything, Manuela was grateful to still have Pedro by her side and did her best to protect him. David listened attentively, and his initial distrust was dispelled with each word. He saw the kindness in Manuela's eyes, even in the midst of pain. Pedro, on the other hand, was a boy full of life who, despite the difficulties, seemed to carry a light that illuminated even the darkest corners of that house in the cemetery. As everyone shared the hot soup, Davi felt something different. That place, which had previously seemed scary, now seemed special. He realized that sometimes, even in the most difficult situations, it is possible to find kindness and strength where you least expect it. The night wore on while Davi, Manuela, and Pedro talked in the small house in the cemetery. With each passing minute, Davi discovered more about that family and felt that there was much more hidden behind the words and looks. Finally, while Pedro played with a scribbled notebook, Manuela took a deep breath and decided to tell him something that seemed to weigh heavily on her heart. "Davi, I need to tell you something important," she began, her voice low but determined. "I was arrested." Davi's eyes widened in surprise. He almost dropped the cup of tea from his hands, but Manuela continued before he could say anything. "But I'm innocent," she said firmly. "I was accused of something I didn't do, and it destroyed my life. While I was there, I lost everything. My home, my family, my job. When I managed to get out, no one wanted to give me a chance. That's how I ended up here." David felt the weight of her words, but something inside him told him he was hearing the truth. Pedro, who was listening to the conversation nearby, suddenly interrupted. "My mother is the most honest person you will ever meet, David, and I believe her." Before the silence became uncomfortable, Pedro changed the subject in a way that left David speechless. He began to speak in another language, fluent as someone who had already studied a lot. "Hey, kid, where did you learn that?" David asked, even more curious. Pedro smiled. "My mother taught me. Before all this, she was a teacher. She knew how to speak several languages. She always said that learning is the only thing no one can take away from you." David was impressed. He would never have imagined that those two people, living in such difficult conditions, had so much wisdom and talent. This only made him respect them even more. The next morning, even though the rain had stopped, David felt that his mission with them was not over yet. Manuela asked for an important favor. She needed to go to the bank to resolve some issues that could help her get her life back on track. Without hesitation, Davi started car and drove them there. He knew it was a small gesture, but it could make all the difference. While waiting in the parking lot, Davi realized something new in himself. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was actually helping someone, not just driving from one place to another. Little did he know that that day would mark the beginning of a friendship and changes that no one expected. After everything he had done to help Manuela and Pedro, Davi felt that, for the first time in a long time, he had done something that really mattered. However, fate seemed to have other plans for him. As soon as he returned to work the next morning, he was greeted by Jeremiah, his boss, who was already waiting with a not-so-friendly look on his face. "Where were you last night, David?" Jeremiah asked, crossing his arms. "I had to make an important stop to help a mother and her son. It wasn't something common, But they needed me, David replied, trying to remain calm. Jeremiah, who never liked to hear explanations, shook his head and began to raise his voice. Do you think you can use my car as if it were yours? I don't care about your good deeds, David. This is work, not charity. Before David could argue, Jeremiah made a decision that seemed to be waiting for the right moment to be announced. You're fired. Pack your things and get out of here. David felt a punch in the stomach. He knew Jeremiah was being unfair, but there was nothing he could do. Without the job, the little money he had saved would soon run out. He returned home that night with his mind full of doubts and worries. Now, without a source of income, David began to feel trapped. The bills kept coming, the rent needed to be paid, and he didn't know how long he could hold out. He even started to think about something he had been avoiding for years, going back to the countryside where he had grown up. The idea of returning to his hometown was bittersweet. For Davi, it was like admitting that he had failed in his attempt to build a better life in the big city. But at the same time, he knew that it might be his only chance to start over. Even so, deep down, Davi felt that he still had something to do there, in that city full of challenges. He just needed to find out what it was. And as he thought about all this, a small flame of hope still shone inside him, reminding him that maybe his story was just beginning. A few weeks had passed since Davi had helped Manuela and Pedro. His life was difficult, and he was still trying to figure out what to do after being fired. The days were full of uncertainty, but he tried to keep his head up, even without knowing what the future held. One afternoon, while Davi was sitting on a park bench, thinking about life, he saw something he could hardly believe. Getting out of an elegant car, impeccably dressed, and with a confident posture, was Manuela. But she looked nothing like the tired and fragile woman he had met weeks ago. Davi, she called, with a radiant smile on her face. David stood up, surprised and speechless. Manuela seemed like a new person, as if she had left behind all the weight of the past. When she approached, he finally asked, Manuela, is that really you? What happened? She smiled again and began to explain. Davi, thanks to your help, I was able to sort things out. I went to the bank, found documents that proved my innocence, and managed to reverse everything that had been done against me. Manuela said that during her unjust imprisonment, dishonest people had taken everything that was hers, including an inheritance left by her family. But with the right documents and the help of lawyers, she was able to prove the truth. Not only did she get everything back that was hers, but she also made sure that those who had harmed her were held accountable. David listened attentively, still trying to process the incredible transformation that had taken place. So you got your life back? He asked, impressed. Yes, and I owe a lot of it to you, Davi, Manuela replied, gratitude in her voice. If you hadn't stopped that night and helped us, perhaps none of this would have been possible. She looked at him with a sparkle in her eyes and said something that Davi never expected to hear. Now it's my turn to help you. David, who was already used to dealing with difficulties alone, hardly knew what to say. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that things were starting to change for the better. Manuela not only brought hope, but also the promise that her kindness would not be forgotten. David's life seemed to have become a whirlwind of emotions in the last few weeks. He was unemployed, full of uncertainty, but still trying to stay strong. It was then that Manuela, now completely back to her life, full of resources and strength, brought news that would change everything. She appeared again, this time with Pedro by her side, both with smiles that seemed to brighten Davi's day. Davi, do you remember when I said it was my turn to help you? Well, I did something that I hope will make you very happy. Davi raised his eyebrows, curious. What did you do, Manuela? She gave a mysterious smile and said, I bought the company where you worked. Davi blinked, incredulous. You bought the taxi fleet? Jeremiah's company. Exactly, she replied excitedly. And what's more, now you're no longer a simple driver, Davi. You're the manager of the company. You're the one who will decide how things will work from now on. Davi felt as if the ground had disappeared. He never imagined something like this could happen. His gratitude for having helped Manuela and Pedro now turned into a golden opportunity, something he never expected to receive. And Jeremias? Davi asked, still processing everything. Manuela gave a small smile, with a touch of irony. Jeremias. He didn't lose his job, but now he will experience firsthand what it means to be a taxi driver, facing the difficulties you faced. Maybe this will teach him to treat people with more respect. David couldn't help but laugh at the irony of the situation. Jeremias, who had so often belittled him and treated him unfairly, would now be in the driver's seat, dealing with customers and the daily challenges of the profession. As Davi took all in, Pedro looked at him and said, "We knew you were special, Davi. That's why my mother did this. You deserve it." At that moment, Davi realized that his life had come full circle. From an exhausted taxi driver with no prospects, he had become someone capable of making a difference, not only for himself, but also for the other drivers who worked for the company. And so, with the support of Manuela and Pedro, Davi began a new chapter where he finally had control of the steering wheel, not only of the taxi, but of his own life. Davi's life changed completely after Manuela entrusted him with the management of the company. He, who was previously just a taxi driver struggling to survive, now had a huge responsibility, but also a golden opportunity. Davi threw himself headfirst into his work, determined to make everything work out. He started by changing things within the company. He treated all the drivers with respect, unlike Jeremias did. He listened to each one's ideas, improved the condition of the cars, and created an environment where everyone felt valued. Over time, the taxi fleet not only recovered, but also began to grow. More customers, more rides, and more success. Davi was not only a good manager, he was someone who understood the difficulties drivers faced because he had been through it all. And this empathy made all the difference. Soon, the company became known in the city as the best to work for and also the most reliable for passengers. Meanwhile, the relationship between Davi and Manuela blossomed. They spent more and more time together, talking, planning the future, and taking care of Pedro. Manuela admired Davi's determination and kindness, and he, in turn, was enchanted by her strength and generosity. As the months went by, what was friendship turned into something more. Davi realized that he felt something special for Manuela, but he hesitated to say it. Until one day, during a quiet dinner at her house, Manuela took Davi's hand and said, "You not only changed my life, Davi, but you brought back something I thought I had lost forever, the hope of being happy." Davi was speechless for a moment, but soon smiled and replied, "I only did what my heart told me to do, Manuela. But if it brought you happiness, it brought me double the happiness." It was then that, in front of Pedro, and with a heart full of courage, Davi asked Manuela to marry him. "I want to build a new story with you. You, Pedro, and I. What do you think?" Manuela couldn't hold back her tears of happiness. "Yes, Davi. 1,000 times yes." And so, they began to plan a future together. Davi continued to transform the company into a true success, while Manuela and Pedro brought love and joy into his life. What began as a rainy night full of uncertainty turned into a happy ending that no one could have imagined. Davi, Manuela, and Pedro proved that, even in the greatest difficulties, it is possible to find a new beginning, and that, when you choose to help others, life gives back in incredible ways.